Now here we have Nietzsche, another man who is widely considered to be a man with terrible views, even more so than Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard really isn't considered that. It was just I who, out of pure cussedness, brought out that Kierkegaard really had some views that would strike many people as terrible, some of which somehow I take perverse pleasure in. I sort of think that they're thought-provoking, that they make us rethink things that we had taken for granted, that even where I cannot agree with him at all, I learn something from him because he makes me reflect on things that otherwise I might not have reflected on. In Nietzsche, on the other hand, because everybody thinks that he has such terrible views, I sort of swim against the stream here too, by trying to point out that his views really weren't quite so terrible, and what I just read you is a good example. Some people get their hackles up as soon as they hear Nietzsche speaking about the herd animal. This shows his being undemocratic and all that sort of thing. But if you listen once more to the words that I just read you, I wonder whether most of you wouldn't agree that what he characterizes here is precisely some of the most disgraceful things that have happened in our own democracy since World War II, namely that an equality of rights could all too easily be converted into an equality in violating rights, into a common war on all that is rare, strange, or privileged, on the higher man, the higher soul, the higher duty, the higher responsibility, and on the wealth of creative power and mastery. We've had a lot of that since World War II. But let us generalize and not engage at this point in any special pleading for Nietzsche. Let's say, all right, he did have some terrible views, like Kierkegaard and like Plato and like Homer and like Dante and like Dostoevsky, all people who are terribly worth reading and who had perfectly dreadful ideas about all sorts of things. Homer obviously took a great delight in cruelty, thought that it was terribly funny to beat up a hunchback. Dante's sense of humor was even much more gruesome than that. And if it wasn't humor, it's even worse. And in Dostoevsky's case, perhaps some of you are not aware of some of his perfectly dreadful opinions. Here then is the question, is philosophy perhaps in some sense closer to literature than to science? In literature, certainly, we don't consider it necessary for a great writer first to assure us that he has wholesome views. Is philosophy similar to that? Well, perhaps at least partly so. Perhaps there are some similarities between philosophy and poetry, philosophy and literature. Men share what Tolstoy once called a fear to understand things that clash with their own customs, privileges, or beliefs. I think we all share that fear. Some of us are a little more housebroken than others. Some of us have mastered this fear to some extent. Some of us perhaps are never conscious of this fear, but still, I think all of us find, if we are very honest with ourselves, that on occasion we don't try very hard to understand things that clash with our own customs, privileges, or beliefs. And just as it is one of the functions of literature to force us to enter into ideas, views that clash with our customs, privileges, and beliefs, so philosophers too might have this job, among others, to make men more sensitive to other points of view, to show men how an outlook that's widely slandered and despised looks and feels from inside. To that extent, a philosopher, I think, is closer to an artist, and particularly a novelist or a dramatist, than he is to a scientist. Now, there are differences, however. A novelist or a dramatist may occasionally examine an argument. He really doesn't have to. A philosopher constantly has to evaluate the arguments for and against alternative positions. And this can be quite thrilling. This can be quite interesting to do this. This is an important part of philosophy. The point that I'm making is not particularly original or revolutionary in our time. It was made long ago by Socrates in that perhaps most famous saying of his, that the unexamined life is not worth living. It's part of the function of a philosopher to lead people to examine their lives. And one way of doing that is by being provocative, by provoking people, by offering them terrible views to make them think. Wittgenstein has put this point beautifully, if only in a posthumously published letter to a younger friend and student. I'll quote it. "What is the use of studying philosophy if all that it does for you is to enable you to talk with some plausibility about some abstruse questions of logic, etc., and if it does not improve your thinking about the important questions of everyday life, if it does not make you more conscientious?" I know that it's difficult to think well about certainty, probability, perception, etc., but it is, if possible, still more difficult to think or try to think really honestly about your life and other people's lives. And the trouble is that thinking about these things is often downright nasty. And when it's nasty, then it's most important. I find this a terribly moving letter. I think Wittgenstein himself, on this particular point, didn't practice what he preached. I think Nietzsche did practice what Wittgenstein here preached. He was nasty enough, I think, to suit any of you. But nasty not just for the sake of being nasty, but nasty because he tried to think really honestly about his own life and other people's lives. Nietzsche himself put the same point a number of times. One of his briefest formulations is that he said that it was a very trite idea to have the courage of one's convictions. What really mattered was to have the courage for an attack on one's convictions, which is another way of saying, in his somewhat more aggressive manner, the courage to examine one's convictions, the courage to re-examine one's convictions, the courage to ask whether there isn't something wrong with them. You find the same thing beautifully expressed in a letter to a sister right at the beginning of the portable Nietzsche, where he says, "Here the ways of men part. If you want peace of mind, then believe, and if you want to have the truth, then inquire," and where he pictures how difficult a way of life it may be if you inquire, how often you are bound to be unsure, how often your conscience is apt to bother you, how often you may live in what Kierkegaard might have called fear and trembling. I think what makes Nietzsche particularly remarkable is that he is a rare embodiment of what I consider the Socratic philosophic spirit. There may be some things about his personality that are not so attractive. In this respect, I think he is thoroughly admirable. In his uninhibited passion for truth and in his rarely equaled craving for intellectual integrity. These are rare qualities. They are not often encountered. I'll be terribly brief about his life and about his personality. Some of the major points may be very well known to most of you, and so there's no need to dwell on them. One thing that's mildly interesting is that Nietzsche's father was born the same year as Kierkegaard, in 1813. I just mention it because it indicates that Nietzsche is really one generation later. He didn't read Kierkegaard. Georg Brandes, who was the first to discover Nietzsche and one of the first to discover Kierkegaard and also helped to discover such people as Ibsen and as Strindberg, called Nietzsche's attention to Kierkegaard in a letter just at the end of Nietzsche's life, and Nietzsche didn't get around anymore to procuring any of Kierkegaard's works. Nietzsche himself was born in 1844 and died in 1900. His father died when he was a little boy. He was brought up by his mother together with his sister and also with the benefit of a grandmother and two maiden aunts. Eventually escaped to the university where he studied classical philology, and at the very young age of not yet 25 became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, Switzerland. The greatest experience of his Basel period, of his period as a professor, was his temporary friendship with Richard Wagner, also, if I remember right, born in 1813, also of the generation of Nietzsche's father, a very asymmetrical friendship in which Wagner appreciated the young intellectual who was his errand boy, bought Christmas presents for the family, could be persuaded to append to his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, a long, very purple prosy eulogy of Richard Wagner, and that was appreciated by Wagner at a time when Wagner was not much appreciated. But sooner or later, this relationship had to come to an end, even if the particular things that did happen hadn't happened, because Wagner had no interest in Nietzsche's striving for intellectual independence, had no sympathy at all for Nietzsche's particularly personal aspirations, so that Nietzsche could either give those up permanently and just become a publicity man for Wagner, or had to break with Wagner. He did the latter. It happened after Wagner went to Bayreuth and established there a great center of Wagnerism, also of anti-Semitism and Francophobia and all sorts of political ideas that Nietzsche didn't like. The capstone, as many of you know, was when Wagner wrote Parsifal, which Nietzsche thought was a very unpleasant affair, because he did not for a moment think that Wagner really now had faith, but felt that the old atheist who had prided himself on his atheism and called himself Schopenhauer's first disciple, and also a modern Aeschylus, that this man now was using Christianity and the idea of the pure fool, a very un-Greek idea, for theatrical effect. So they broke. Nietzsche, shortly after, also resigned from the university and then lived for another 10 years in relative poverty in Switzerland and Italy most of the time, Switzerland in the summers, Italy in the winters, and his heroism, which I think was very real, was very different from those from those terribly theatrical busts and drawings that you have seen with the huge moustaches that were commissioned by the sister after he had become insane and was an imbecile and could not protest. His heroism consisted in the fact that his health was terrible, that the doctors kept advising him to take it easy, to take care of his eyes, not to read so much, not to write so much, and that he burnt himself out publishing, not like Kierkegaard, so many books a year, but quite steadily, one book a year, and put everything into that until there was nothing left of him anymore, and he became insane.